Welcome back, everyone, to the HNL Movement Podcast. I am super excited about this episode. We're going to dive into a lot of interesting things that pertain to all of us because we're all aging, and we're going to talk about longevity and aging. But I'm so happy to have Chris Mirabile. He's the CEO and founder of NOVOS to join me today. So welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you, Andrew. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so let's dive into it first. Before we get started on your journey, what great things you're doing with NOVOS. Let's start with just give us the elevator pitch of what NOVOS does, what you have founded and created, and some of the interesting, fascinating things that we all should pay attention to.
Sure. So NOVOS is a consumer longevity biotech company. So that's a lot. What does that actually mean? So we are one of the very first companies that is addressing consumer longevity as opposed to anti-aging, which has been around for decades or even centuries. Anti-aging, I would describe as something that tends to try to hide the signs of aging. For example, maybe moisturizing your skin makes your skin look a little bit healthier, but it's not changing anything fundamentally biological about your aging process. Whereas longevity, and there's an entire field of medicine and biotech for the longevity field, is looking at the causes, the underlying biological causes of aging, and how can we interrupt those causes or support the healthy function of those aspects of biology so that you can, as we like to say at NOVOS, stay younger for longer. And so NOVOS is a consumer company in this space. You oftentimes will, if you dig into the field, you'll find biotechs, academic professors, even pharmaceutical companies that are looking for opportunities in this space and developing novel treatments. But there are very few consumer companies. And so I started NOVOS because there wasn't anything out there, as far as I was concerned, to be able to do today for myself, for my family, for my loved ones, to be able to address what's known as the hallmarks or mechanisms of aging. These are essentially the causes of aging. I wanted to be able to do something now beyond the obvious, like eating healthy or exercising or getting good sleep. And that is when I decided to create NOVOS.
That is awesome. And this company, I believe, started in 2019.
Yes, that's when we began on the R&D side of things, and then we eventually launched the first formulation in January of 2021.
Yes.
So almost 2 years now.
And this is a whole industry and field that there's so much more growth that needs to be, research that needs to be done, a lot of growth potential. But let's start with your story because it's really amazing. Well, you have a very unique story. And it's something that I think it sets you up for what you're doing right now. But also it's a lot of things that I think people can relate to in some aspect because we all grew up, doing things to try to impact us right now without realizing some of the effects or long-term consequences of what it has on our overall lifespan. But before we dive into that, the other thing that is super fascinating and amazes me is that this is not your background. Like your background is not in aging. Your background is in business and being an entrepreneur, right? So you have to, even when you're explaining the elevator pitch about what NOVOS does, your understanding of this has grown so much, I can imagine, the more that you dug deeper. So let's talk about your story now. You can start, back in your childhood, kind of what started. I've heard snippets of it, but explain to the listeners what started your journey down this path to be super interested and wanting to help all of the general public with this type of aspect of lifespan.
Sure. So you're correct, Andrew, in saying that my professional career path to this point, although it's been very entrepreneurial, it hasn't been specifically in the field of biology. But my personal interest has always been in health and by extension biology. So starting when I was 12 years old and I picked up an issue of Men's Health magazine and decided I was inspired by the people on the covers and wanting to be in good shape and to, at 12 years old, attract the girls in school. So admittedly, a very superficial motivation to get into health, but nonetheless, it was a positive outcome. I started exercising. I started watching my diet, and at the time, it was one of those low fat, high protein diets. And then fast forward to when I was 15 years old. Actually, today is the anniversary of it. So, 23 years ago today, I suddenly had a seizure, and it turned out that it was caused by a brain tumor. And a few days after, just about 3 days after, I was operated on because it was a very large tumor. It was larger than a golf ball in my left temporal lobe, and they had to immediately remove that. And so my interest in health very quickly evolved. I began asking myself existential questions about life, what I wanted to derive from it, how I wanted to shape my life or almost design my life and my future. The fact that I never wanted to be laying in a hospital bed again, thinking about my mortality and how fragile my life was. And so that evolved my interest in health from one that was purely superficial to one that now had this much more important aspect to it, which was biology of health, cellular fitness, avoiding disease, and so on. And so I began to, over the months and years and decades, technically, began to then start digging into the science behind health. And there was a point where I was introduced to someone named Dave Asprey, who founded Bulletproof brand and Bulletproof coffee and so on. And he introduced me to the idea of biohacking. So I began to biohack on my own with different goals like focus and memory and physical performance and so on. And I was experimenting with different supplements, different diets, different exercise routines, sleep hacking, and so on. But all the while I was asking myself the question, are the things I'm doing right now good for me, not only today for this specific biohacking goal, but also good for me in the long term? Is this going to have any sort of negative side effect or consequence in decades from now? And the answer was actually, believe it or not, sometimes it wasn't good for you in the long term and the short term. And I'll give a very simple example of that. Sun exposure is something that you think of as being, in some senses, beneficial. It increases vitamin D production, but not only that, it increases nitric oxide production, which is good for your heart. It's a vasodilator. It increases endorphins, which are the feel-good neurotransmitters. It makes you happy and in a good mood. But at the same time, it also increases the chances of, DNA mutation definitely happens from the UV rays, but it increases the chances over the long term for melanoma, for different types of cancer. And so this is something that I didn't know at the time, but I was stumbling upon a concept known as antagonistic pleiotropy, which is a big word for a simple concept, which is essentially that what is good for you in the short term can actually come back to harm you in the long term. It's actually a little bit more advanced than that, related to genetics, but that's the simple way to think about it. And so I then started to look at everything through that lens of what is good for me, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. Are there things that I can do today that will accomplish my goals of, say, better focus, better physical performance, improved energy, improved mood, while also leading to better health outcomes in the long term? And the answer is yes, there are actually things you can do to get the best of both worlds. You just need to look at everything through that lens. And so I began to do that. I began to research the science of aging, as I mentioned earlier, the biological root causes of aging. I began networking with scientists and talking to them about their papers that I was reading, asking them about different over-the-counter ingredients that have been found to impact the same mechanisms of aging or different biological pathways that are related to aging, like mTOR or AMP kinase and so on. And I was surprised to find that the scientists were actually very optimistic about these ingredients. And I was surprised, I think, because the medical doctors would always be very negative about supplements. They'd say, oh, you're creating expensive urine, just follow my advice and then take prescription drugs when things go wrong, right? Which, we know the medical system's broken. But scientists, they look at the research in its purest form, and they let the experimental evidence point to the truth. And they're not, basing their opinions on the pharmaceutical agenda. At least most of the time they're not. And so this was enough for me to say, okay, there is something here. There is potential to impact these hallmarks of aging without having to invent an entirely new molecule that needs to go through the FDA approval process over the span of years and potentially decades, and may very well end up failing because it's not safe enough or it's not powerful enough. And it's something I can use today, and I can provide to my family, my loved ones, and then the community at large. And that's essentially how NOVOS was born.
That is, yes, it's a long journey, and I can tell this is your passion. And yes, like you said, I can appreciate that too, because being in research and, I'm in the infancy stages, but yes, you look through everything you're trying to take out as much bias as you can. Everyone's going to have a little bias, but you're just looking at the data and finding ways to either explain things or having the science explain it for you, right? And I think with all of the things nowadays, there's so many things, so many competitors trying to sell you the same product and all of that. A lot of that can cloud kind of what is the ultimate goal, right? Of getting this to work. In this case, it would be either a supplement or a longer lifespan, right? So all of that is definitely something that I can appreciate.